All right, for this assignment, I want you to go through the actions of creating a compose file from scratch. So this is a very normal, everyday, basic compose file, and it's an exercise you'll go through a lot in building on applications that you need to work on or test or develop on. So as you get used to compose, you'll actually kind of prefer it locally. It's just so easy to use, and it makes the Docker commands so much easier to remember inside of that compose file. So on this one, you're actually going to build a basic Drupal content management site. So if you're not familiar with Drupal, it's an open source content management server, which is basically just a website builder. And you don't have to know a lot about Drupal, but it's a good example of a fully functional web app, and it needs a database running behind it. So you're going to need to look up the Drupal images and the Postgres image on Docker Hub and read a little bit through their documentation. Of course, I recommend using the official images, and there's some other things there. You'll want to use the ports inside the compose file to actually expose Drupal. I recommend just doing it on 8080. You can really do it on any port you want, but let's just pick 8080 for this assignment. You're going to end up with two services. I recommend version 2 at the very top of your file, and you'll have those two services underneath it, one for Drupal, one for Postgres. You can call the services whatever you want. Inside the Postgres service, you're going to need to make sure you set a password for it. And then the way that Drupal works is that once you've started it with Docker Compose up, you'll actually open up your browser and walk through the setup. And Drupal has a nice web-based setup. It'll ask you some questions. But a tip there is that the way these containers work in compose files is, remember that it uses the service name as the DNS name for one container to talk to the other. So as you're setting it up, one of the options you'll see under advanced is where the database server is, and it defaults to localhost. And that's not going to work, because that would mean that you'd have to have your database and your web server in the same container. And that's not really a best practice for Docker. So in that case, you're going to need to change the localhost to whatever you call the Drupal service. Then the Drupal web server will actually talk over the Docker network to the database server. If you want to go a little bit extra credit, there's an option that you'll see on the Drupal documentation on Docker Hub about using volumes to store the unique data, like the template data and the uploads and the add-ons for Drupal that are called modules. You'll see that some documentation around that, and I recommend you experiment with that and see if you can get it working in the compose file. And then after you started it, going and listing out the volumes to see if you can see them there and that they look correct. So this should be a fairly short compose file, probably 10 or so lines. And of course, if you get stuck, no worries. The next lecture will have me walking through the same exercise you're about to go through. So good luck and have some fun. All right, so this is me walking through the second compose assignment for creating a Drupal configuration. So I'm in the compose assignment 2 directory, and I'm supposed to make a Docker compose file in here. I'm going to switch over to Visual Studio Code, make a new file. Now I can call it whatever I want, but the easiest way to use Docker Compose is just by calling the file Docker Compose YAML. Otherwise, I have to actually specify the file every time, or set an environment variable, and that's kind of a pain. So let's just do it like this. All right, it said version 2, right? Was one of the requirements. And then I type services, and you'll notice this add-in, by the way. This is the Docker add-on for Visual Studio Code, which is one of the great things I love about Code. It's a great editor, and it actually has abilities to, in the background, search Docker Hub. So you'll notice some things popping up as I type them. So if I know I got to do Drupal, I'm just going to call this one Drupal. And then I know I have to use an image. I'm going to call it Drupal because I bet you that's the name of the image. See how it actually pulls up there from Docker Hub? Pretty cool. And then I know I have to use ports to open up 8080 on my machine to, you know what? I don't know what port to use in the image. So let me actually go here and search for Drupal. And let's see, what's the documentation say? So here's an example. It looks like it's port 80 inside the container. If I wanted to confirm that, I could actually go inside. I'm just going to use latest for this example. I can actually go inside the Docker file here, and it looks like it's coming from PHP Apache, and there's no port command here. So if I actually want to know what the port was, I could do several things. I could either go look up that from image and see what the expose command was in there, or if I had the Drupal locally, and then I did a docker image inspect Drupal, expose ports, port 80. So I bet you that's what it's listening on. So I can just change that to 80. And then I know for extra credit, I'm supposed to use volumes, but I'm going to come back to that. So the other one is going to be Postgres, and then image. Oops, no. I don't want either one of those choices. All right. I don't need any ports there because it's just going to use the default one inside the network. And you notice you only need to use ports here when you actually need to use the -p. And since these are both going to be in the same Docker network, I don't need to do anything for them to connect. They're just going to work over that network. And I know the instructions said I need to set a password. I'm just going to set it to something easy for now. If I back up here, I wonder what Docker says, what Drupal says about that. So if I want to use this, so if I don't use Postgres user, then it defaults to Postgres. So everything defaults to Postgres. So the database defaults to that, the user defaults to that. So I just need to set the password. So I got that. I think I'm about done, except for the volumes. Let's see what it says here. Volumes. Oh, look at that. They have some examples here. So I could just copy these. I'm just going to copy all 4 of them. Multiple cursors is also a pretty cool thing in Visual Studio Code. Okay, those look good. I'm going to save this file. Okay, let's run it and see if it works. Right, if I'm going to use named volumes, I've got to do the volume section. And that's why this is a little extra credit. So let me actually go into the documentation for Compose and look up how volumes are supposed to be there. And it says that I can use the named volumes without anything else in them, like this. So let me try that. Oh, look at that. I just noticed I'm missing the D there. Oh, all right. All right, let's try again. See how it creates the networks and the volumes right before it starts? That's pretty cool. Saves us time. All right. Looks like everything's started. Let me go to localhost 8080. All right, there we go. Now let me go through the setup real quick. Sure, standard. I'm using Postgres. The database name is Postgres. And if you weren't aware, you could actually go to Hub, and under the Postgres, there'll be documentation about how the default database works. And all the environment variables, it'll tell you here that if you don't specify the DB, it will actually be Postgres by default. My password was my password. And because I've done this before, I actually know that if I click here, it's going to tell me I can't connect because I'm thinking I need to talk to localhost. And that tells me, aha. I actually have to back up here, re-put in my password, and under advanced, it defaults to localhost, and I need it to be the name of my service, which I just called Postgres. I can see all the not the errors, but the logs in the background. It's doing stuff. It does say errors there, though, doesn't it? Well, it's working. And here's some basic information. Just gonna put in some stuff. Let's see. Just call that. All right, there we go. Looks like I got a fully working Drupal website. And now that I'm done, I can actually just Control C, and I want to do a cleanup. So I want to do a down, but there's actually an option to remove the volumes. And so since I don't plan on using this, I'll use down-V to remove the volumes as well. Because of course, Docker is always trying to protect volumes by default. There's no Docker commands other than Docker volume remove and prune that will actually automatically remove volumes because it's always assuming that you want to persist your data. All right, there we go.